the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. Only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place, and
yes,
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. Obviously they will join the links of dissenters, dissidents. Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be a greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. So basically America is stuck with demoralization, and unless, even if you start right now, here, this minute, you start educating new generation of Americans, it will still take you 15 to 20 years to turn the tide of ideological perception of reality back to normalcy and patriotism. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, it doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. With a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely.
Mao encouraged the Red Guards to attack Western influences and to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Without this destruction, he said, socialism cannot be achieved. The Red Guards tore down street signs and put up new revolutionary names. They ransacked museums, libraries, and temples. They searched and looted people's homes. Groups of Red Guards roamed the countryside, urging peasants to attack local officials. Throughout China, party officials, intellectuals, people with foreign connections, former businessmen, millions were paraded and beaten in public. It is estimated that at least 400,000 people were killed.
I didn't think about it much. Chairman Mao called on us to be involved with affairs of state, to be active in making revolution. We felt this was revolution. Chairman Mao had said, a revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. It's not a dinner party. We had to be rough and harsh and wild.
By 1967, the Radical Cultural Revolution Group dominated the government. Members included Lin Biao and Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. She often appeared as Mao's spokesperson and had gained great power. Her calls for violent struggle were immediately obeyed by millions of Red Guards. Moderate leaders, repulsed by the fanaticism, felt closer to Zhou Enlai. Zhou's role in the Cultural Revolution is ambiguous. He tried to moderate events, but in the end he always sided with Mao. He tried to protect people, but his power had limits. Many close to him would soon be brutally attacked.
This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. He will go to Moscow to kiss the bottoms of new generation of Soviet assassins, never mind. He will create false illusions that the situation is under control. Situation is not under control. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. United States is in the state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. And the initiator of this war is not Comrade Andropov, of course. It's the system. However ridiculous it may sound, the world communist system or the world communist conspiracy, whether I scare some people or not, I don't give a hoot. If you are not scared by now, nothing can scare you. But you don't have to be paranoid about it. What actually happens now, that unlike myself, you have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to, unless you want to live in Antarctica with penguins. This is it. This is the last country of freedom and possibility.
More human beings were slaughtered in the 20th century than all previous centuries combined.
We're talking a congressional record, 135 million dead.
Their entire purpose was to detach our culture from any moral anchors whatsoever.
You look at the changes in America since 1960, perhaps. The whole culture's been transformed.
They're coming out of the belief that the village should raise the child. The village means the government.
They have deliberately destroyed the American family, understanding that's the foundational block that builds a society.
We've come from Norman Rockwell's America to Hugh Hefner's America.
The left wants you to think that the cultural changes that have taken place in America since the 1960s have done nothing but progress us forward toward a brave new world.
They look at what holds society together, they understand it, but they don't want that. They want change, and they will subvert and rot every good and decent thing we believe in, because they have a vision for a new society, and that must mean the replacement of the old society.
This film will show that the brave new world they seek is nothing more than the failed policies and ideologies of the communism that enslaved over a third of the world's population during the 20th century. It will show that most people on the left aren't communist, just the useful idiots Lenin spoke of, being used to promote a socialist agenda, which is the first and necessary step toward communism.
They basically try to say that the state itself is ultimate, that there's nothing, no law higher than the state, and if there's no law higher than the state, there's no appeal against it.
Under the new government, the Committee of Public Safety, they accumulated all power to a central government authority, established a state-run atheist cult of reason, and launched the Reign of Terror, to put to the guillotine all who oppose them. This idea of brutal suppression in the name of the greater good, of eliminating tradition and belief, and of holding a single centralized power of government that could control the lives of each individual, would lead to the ideas of communism and its system of socialism that would eventually sweep the world. And through history leading up until today, these two competing ideas of freedom and socialism have been at the heart of arguments on the role of government and the place of citizens. This has led to many attacks on the American character in attempts to demonize not just our history, but even the founding principles of this country. Yet who are the groups leading this charge against America?
So you have a situation where this Constitution has protected Americans' rights for 200 years. Their right to free speech, to assembly, their right to keep and bear arms, their protection from seizure of their assets, unlawful searches, unreasonable searches. It's given the American people more freedom than anybody has enjoyed in world history, and consequently more prosperity than anybody has enjoyed in American history. But it has stopped tyrants gaining power. And so the Constitution is the enemy of all tyrants. So every tyrant in America right now, from the radical left to the globalists to big tech to the Communist Party of China, are all trying to destroy the US Constitution. Because if they can do that, they have complete power over every aspect of our lives. That's their dream, and that's our nightmare. The left has tried to demonize America. It's tried to propagandize against this country, to create racial division here, to use the fifth column, the communists within this country, to create as many problems as they can. So America has to be destroyed. It has to be destroyed morally. It has to be destroyed through propaganda and even physically, because America is the example of what people could be, of what freedom can look like, of the prosperity, the creativity that is unleashed when you have a free society. The American people, in my experience, are the most benevolent people, the kindest people, and the most tolerant people that exist on the planet. But they're also a little bit naive and a little bit complacent, and they think it's all going to go on forever, and they do not understand that every evil dictator on the planet is working overtime to bring this country to its knees.
The New York Times has a new project marking 400 years since the first African slaves were brought here to the U.S.
The 1619 Project, in an attempt to reframe America's history through the lens of slavery.
The New York Times Magazine is launching a series called the 1619 Project.
How is it that America is being attacked? Much of this narrative is coming from a rewriting and falsifying of American history. There's a push now to adopt the framework of the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which even its own fact-checker said contained false claims into American education. There are radicals pushing to tear down statues of America's history, ban books that present history they don't like, and physically attack anyone who espouses the ideas of freedom that they hope to destroy. Many of these people are animated, however, by a false understanding of American history. And one of the main authors who spread this falsified history was communist sympathizer Howard Zinn, author of the 1980 book, People's History of the United States.
Howard Zinn's interpretation goes back to 1913 to Charles Beard, whose theory has been debunked several times over. And Charles Beard had a materialist interpretation of the Constitution. He basically said that it was set up by men of privilege to preserve their material privilege. And Howard Zinn pretended to be uncovering this long-lost theory, and, as if it were brand new, and said, you think that the founders, set up this Constitution in order for the general welfare and the harmony of society and to keep law and order and to protect individual rights. Well, no, that's not really true. Here, let me tell you about this revolutionary theory by Charles Beard. And so Zinn basically reinvents that and says that they had set it up to preserve their own power, that enough, it was very clever of them, they gave enough to the middle classes, the craftsmen, the mechanics, and so forth, in order to keep them satisfied.
Now, this is the way that they frame the American Constitution and the American system is that, they frame America as this system of slavery, of oppression, rather than the opposite interpretation, which used to be the take on it, that America was a symbol of freedom for the world.
Well, it was, a beacon. I mean, there were very few places where people had rights guaranteed to them, and where there weren't titles of royalty, where people weren't allowed to think of themselves as sort of elevating themselves by their own efforts.
Among the many tricks that Howard Zinn used was to take information out of context in order to falsify its meaning. This included, for example, taking the Journal of Christopher Columbus, beginning a quote from one page, and using an ellipsis to continue the quote several pages later, completely altering its meaning. In contrary to the narrative spread these days that America's founding fathers launched their revolution only to preserve their rights to hold slaves, in reality, they fought a near impossible battle against the most powerful empire in the world, with many losing their fortunes and even their lives in the process. Contrary to the falsified stories now being presented, the reason the founding fathers launched the revolution is clearly explained in their notes, and clearly laid out in the Declaration of Independence. It states, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having an indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states." And it lays out 27 grievances committed against the colonial Americans. Among these were trial without jury, burning towns, abdicating the local government, taxing without consent, and transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, among others. But the question remains, if the founding fathers believed in freedom, then why did they have slavery?
The Declaration, as approved by the Continental Congress, has a list of charges against King George III. And following the rules of rhetoric, you start with the least and you end with the worst, right? But then you get to his final charge, and his final charge is this. He says, King George III has created cruel war against human nature itself, enslaving men, and Jefferson puts men, right? So any question here about were blacks included under all men are created equal? Yes. Abraham Lincoln thought that the bloodiness of the Civil War was spiritual payback for the sin of slavery. So yes, absolutely, we understand the contradiction, as Lincoln put it, between the theory of equality and the practice of slavery at the time. But here's the point. The founders were aware of that contradiction. And they all envisioned, especially at the time of the founding, slavery gradually withering away. Thomas Jefferson, after we declared revolution and each state wrote its own constitution, Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, proposed that Virginia outlaw slavery in its constitution. So this caricature that you have these evil, rich white men who designed a constitution to keep the poor down and to keep minorities down and to keep women down, it's so easy to see the falsehood of that if you just spend a little time reading what they actually said and were trying to do. Frederick Douglass, to Abraham Lincoln, to Martin Luther King Jr., who all said that your Declaration and Constitution are wonderful, noble principles, now just live up to them better. They would replace that with the rejection of the Declaration of Independence, the rejection of equality of opportunity, and governments intervening in order to ensure equal outcomes, which means an end to individual liberty.
It's certainly true that in the 18th century, everyone was a racist. We're talking something that's 225 years ago, and obviously if that existed today, we would condemn it. The point about the Constitution isn't that social reality of racism. It's, in fact, the reality that these founders, and not just the men who wrote it, but the families that raised them, their moms, their siblings, the unnamed people in history, ironically even some of their slaves or free people of color, were part of a society that did something very radical, first with the Declaration and then with the Constitution. And that was, say, two things. The first is that government's job is to defend our liberties. Its whole purpose, actually, is to make sure that we have our freedoms. And the second is that whatever government does comes from the consent of the governed. The Constitution was the vehicle by which we could enshrine the rights of those people who had been oppressed. So in fact, those people who believe that America is an imperfect society ought to first accept that the Constitution is the vehicle that allows us to address some of the significant social concerns they have. What the Constitution got perfect, I would say that very rarely as a historian, was putting two seemingly competing goods, two competing aims in balance. On the one hand, liberty, and on the other hand, order. And what I've told students over the years is we don't want unfettered liberty because it's chaotic. We also don't want just complete order because there's not a lot of freedom. What the Constitution did was put into constitutional governance the ability of our governed and the government to keep those things in balance.